But, if you want to know the effect of any kind of bill that Congress is, going to pass or the president's going to sign, it's easy. You just look at the title and you just think the opposite. So this bill is titled the Inflation Reduction Act. That means the bill is going to make inflation higher. That's always the case, right? If they have a tax simplification plan, it's going to make the tax system more complicated. It's always the opposite. And that's exactly what this bill is going to do. If it's signed into law, it will make inflation worse. Inflation will go up. It will not go down. And that's because you do not fight inflation by increasing government spending. You do not fight inflation by raising taxes on businesses. Because when you raise taxes on corporations, businesses, what you end up doing is getting less investment and you reduce supply. So less stuff gets produced, and that puts more upward pressure on prices. When the government spends more money, that's more demand, and that's putting more upward pressure on prices. The only legislation that the government could pass that would reduce inflation would be significant cuts in government spending, right? That would reduce or eliminate the budget deficits so that the Fed no longer had to monetize them. Also, the government could substantially repeal all sorts of rules and regulations that are currently running up the cost of doing business. And so if they reduce those costs, then businesses could pass on those savings to their customers. If they want to try to go after inflation through tax hikes, the only tax hikes that might work would be taxes that are targeted to the middle class and the poor, because you have to reduce demand. You have to reduce spending. Obviously, if you raise taxes on the middle class, they have less money to spend. But they're not going to do that. And of course, I don't prefer that. I would rather have government cut spending. But if it's not going to cut spending, the only choice is to raise taxes. If they do neither, then inflation is going to continue and get worse.
They say the president is suddenly on the verge of a turnaround that the White House believes could salvage his summer and alter the trajectory of his presidency. All he needs to do now is close. And that means getting Kirsten Sinema to sign on to this and then to take the victory lap that the media will be all too happy to provide him.
Look, all Biden is doing and the Democrats, they're taking advantage of the fact that the public is upset about inflation. So they take a bill that is not going to reduce inflation, that will actually make it worse. They name it the Inflation Reduction Act. And now that they have an act with a title that nobody wants to vote against because everybody is in favor of reducing inflation, and then they load it up with a bunch of pork. And that's basically what this is. It's an excuse to enable the Democrats to get all this pork barrel legislation passed by promising the public it's going to lower inflation when it's actually going to make inflation higher.
They have, just to put some numbers on it, Wall Street Journal editorial board out very much against this bill for many of the reasons you cite. They say if their aim is to reduce inflation by chilling business investment and the economy, nailed it. $433 billion in climate and healthcare spending. It's sort of like, what's the healthcare spending doing in there? $615 billion in new taxes and drug price control, quote, savings. They're pointing out how the new tax is going to increase the cost of business investment. And that actually, according to the Tax Foundation, the coal industry is going to be the hardest hit. That's Manchin's hometown, right? He's from West Virginia. So what's he doing? That companies are going to get tax credits for spending on wind, solar, minerals, as I mentioned, nuclear, yes, quote, sustainable aviation fuel and so on, electric vehicle charging stations. But that they say the Biden administration is using regulation to essentially mandate that automakers churn out electric vehicles. And now the taxpayers are going to subsidize that cost, which they can ill afford to do.
The best thing that happened to the Biden administration is that Joe Manchin stopped the Build Back Better bill. Because you imagine how much worse things would be if that thing had been passed?
Mm-hmm. Well, he seems to be saying this is a mini Build Back Better, but that it's much better than Build Back Better, that people are going to like it more.
It's less worse. I wouldn't say that it's good, but yes, it's not as bad.